Okay, let's try this again. Welcome, I'm Colonel Peoples. This is Arizona 2006-3. We're here for our Army Day to learn about Army background, history, organization, and we have Lieutenant Colonel Dan Hink from Phoenix Army Junior RTC who drove up here to Prescott for 4 hours of lecture today. Sir, this is our leadership class here to begin with, and I will turn everything over to you.
Thank you, sir. All right, well, good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Yes, I want to thank you all for this great Prescott frozen morning. This is why I live in Phoenix and not in Prescott. I was stationed in Seattle for almost total, on 2 different occasions, 8 years. So I know wet and I know cold, and that's why I live in Arizona. I don't like wet and cold. If I can avoid it at all costs, that's what I do. Again, I am Lieutenant Colonel Dan Hink, United States Army Infantry. Infantry means these 2 little crossed rifles on my uniform. The Air Force does not usually necessarily wear branch insignia, and to be honest, in the new Army uniform, in the blues that you see more and more of, they don't see the Army insignia. But these 2 crossed rifles, or everybody outside of the infantry calls the crossed idiot sticks, that's what defines me as infantry. And the infantry is called the Queen of Battle. It is the branch that gains ground, that fights and engages with the enemy in close combat. And that is a very antiseptic way to talk about getting down and dirty and the really nasty part of combat. There's a lot more sanitary ways to fight wars, of which the Air Force has modeled that for us for many years. But down there in the dirt and the ground, and usually the F-16 pilots say, "Oh, I can see the earth pigs down there." I'm sure the colonel never called us that.
No, I'm not an F-16 pilot, an F-15 pilot.
No,
F-15 people love the Army because you know what? I'm glad somebody's doing that
That's
job,
right.
so I don't have to do it.
And there's all kinds of things. And when an Air Force pilot would have to come down and spend a little time with us as a forward air controller, that was purgatory for them.
They leave as quick as possible.
That's right. But they paid their dues. They got down and dirty, put a little camouflage underneath their eyes, and pretended they were dirty. But the first thing I want to do is I want to play a little video. This is our opportunity to expound on the Army recruiting plan and how we look at the Army. And it's kind of a neat little thing. I wanted you to watch it just as a chance to kind of see how we see ourselves in some cases. So let me play this for you.
Turn the lights off. Somebody in the back, please.
We should have some sound here.
There's some mute here.
I don't know. Did we?
Yeah, it's muted down at the bottom.
Oh, yeah, it is. There we go. Sorry. It's not showing. It's come on, maybe.
Click it in the middle.
Yeah. Somewhere in that bar.
Oh, no, it's on.
Yeah, it should be playing.
Yeah, you just gotta play press button.
Okay, well, let's just try that again. See if I can. There we go. Okay, start it over. There we go. Well, if that doesn't make you feel like getting up and rolling around in the mud a little bit, I don't know what does.
That's great.
All right.
Teach us how to say oorah.
Hoorah! Can you all say that? Hoorah! Hoorah! Come on, do this one more time. Hoorah! 1, 2, 3.
Hoorah!
That's close enough. We'll get there.
We got 4 hours of practice.
Yeah, it's really. The famous thing about hoorah is that it, or hoo-ah, it really is more the term. There's no such thing, it's a negative, there's no negative hoo-ah. You can't say there's no hoo-ah no. It's always hoo-ah yes. So whenever someone says hoo-ah, that means yes. The problem is it means yes to everything. Are you an idiot? Hoo-ah. Okay. Are you dirty? Hoo-ah. But there's no the hoo-ah. Whenever it says no hoo-ah, they mean yes. It's a positive concept. And that's the thing that kind of drives people crazy a little bit, because you'll get a lot of hoo-ahs, and then you say, do you all understand hoo-ah? And they don't have a clue. It went right over their heads. And when you look at a bunch of privates and a bunch of soldiers, and you go, okay, do you understand what I just said? Hoo-ah! No, okay, wait. Let's take it from time out, and let's find out if everyone really understands what I'm talking about. So every so often, when I will look out amongst you, I will ask you questions, because this is a collaborative process. I'd like to teach in the Socratic method, which is to ask questions and get responses, so I can make fun of you if nothing else. But the real bottom line is that it's a way to contribute. Nobody likes for lectures. We've tried to go away from lecture mentality, although as you go on to college, guess what your professors do? Lecture. And that's all they do. They walk in, walk out, and if you didn't get it, tough bananas. You're going to have to learn it. Again, I am U.S. Army Infantry. Like I said, my crossed rifles say that I'm an earth pig, a ground pounder, an 11 bang bang, all kinds of the pejorative terms that are used to identify the infantry. But during the course of these briefs, we'll talk about the infantry branches. And the branches of the infantry are kind of unique in some ways, because they do define the Army more so than any of the other services. The Air Force, the Navy, even the Marine Corps are a little more homogenized in some ways. But in the service, in the Army, your branch defines you as who you are and what you do. It's very specific, and it has a tradition and a heritage all of its own. Let me just go down to the briefs here real quick and go through it. And again, at any point during this brief, as you have a question or not sure what I'm talking about, please raise your hand, ask me so I can expand on this. Because there's a lot of this stuff that's probably going to sound a little bit foreign to you. The verbiage is kind of esoteric. And we do have a tendency to descend in what we call acronym valley. We start talking acronyms and abbreviations, and it goes like, what the heck is he talking about? So if you don't know, ask me. But anyway, the U.S. Army consists of 3 elements: the active Army and the reserve components, and the civilian workforce is not considered part of the Army. They are called government employees, and they are the ones that work throughout. DA civilians, another term for them, but they work throughout the military. One of the key issues is this is how the military is broken down. And this is not unique to the Army. The Navy, the Air Force have reserve and guard components themselves. And I'll talk more about that in the other briefs. But initially we're going to talk about the active Army. And the active Army is very basically the ground force of the United States Army. Okay, it is the oldest of the services, created before we were a nation, along with the Marine Corps actually, and the Navy. Before there was 1776, there was 1775, the United States Army. Who commanded the first army?
General George Washington.
Was it?
General George.
Very good. He was sent out by the Constitutional Congress, the guys who are trying to create a constitution in a country, and said, go out and fight the British. Well, who am I fighting for? Well, the colonies and this group. We didn't have a country yet. So the Army is older than the country itself. Now, later on in 1947 and in 1949, there was a broader perspective, a structural discussion that was created that really, first of all, brought the Air Force into existence, but also created a current structure for the U.S. forces. That's a significant time from 1775 to 1947. How did we operate in between those 2 times? It was very loosey-goosey. It was very kind of, I'm not sure how this is going to work. This regiment did this, and this regiment did that, and this organization did this, and there was a lot of structural issues, a lot of problems. One of the biggest problems when you don't have a good organization, can anybody tell me what makes that hard on? If you don't have the same organization throughout the military or the Army, who does that really mess up? Where does that become really hard? Think outside the box a little bit. Anybody got an idea? How does that make the Army and supporting the Army difficult? Anybody know? Well, it's called logistics. Like, UPS, I like logistics. If everyone's using a different caliber rifle, or everyone's got a different type of cannonball, how hard is it to resupply them? Extremely hard. That's a problem. Commonality and sort of a continuity of logistics was one of the main reasons we got into World War II and World War I in this century, and the Army and the other services had a lot of trouble because everyone wanted their own way of doing things, and in many cases, it didn't work. Okay, the Army's major roles: to maintain the ability to respond to any aggression, to be well-trained, equipped to prevent conflict, have land forces, key part there being land forces, to bring about conflict, end of conflicts in terms favorable to the United States, always a tricky idea, and to fulfill a peaceful role by contributing to general support and domestic programs. Can the United States Army operate inside of the United States?
Yes.
Okay. Can it? Legally?
No, sir, I don't think so.
It cannot. It cannot legally. We can't roll tanks out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Fort Knox, California, Fort Knox, Kentucky. I'm sorry, I forget where Knox went. And go downtown and take over the countryside. Why is that? Anybody know? This is a politics. This is kind of a structural issue. The federal government, does the federal government control the states? Not really. It's a long story. But who controls the states? The states, the state governments. We could not, the forces at Fort Huachuca can't roll out and take over Sierra Vista, which is the town right next to it, because that's illegal. It is against the Constitution of the United States. So we make a very, very clear defining line between what is federal and what is state. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the reserve forces. But the bottom line is we do support a peacetime role. And there is a term, and if you were taking notes, I'd make you write it down. It's called posse comitatus. Anybody ever heard that before? Posse comitatus is simply a legal definition of meaning that you can, in fact, bring in federal forces if the area has been federalized. You ever heard the term martial law? That's if the United States of America, in a federal format, goes in and takes over this area and says, this is now federal land for a certain period of time. Anybody remember when this happened last? When they... What's that?
That would be 1966, the Montgomery, Alabama riots.
Well, that was part of it, although not really. They just brought in military police and some forces for civil rights actions. You really know what happened during Katrina down in Louisiana. It was such a nightmare. The police had sort of fallen apart. A lot of them had been taken off. That the military came in, mostly National Guard, and they federalized parts of Louisiana and New Orleans. We're going to take care of it for a little while, and then we're going to hand it back to the states. It's a very specific rule about where the federal forces can go and where the state forces can go. And the United States Army, as it's delineated now, is a federal force. So it's important to understand that. People don't really understand it. When sometimes we hear people about, they're going to come and take our guns away. The Army's going to march out of Sierra Vista and go take your guns away. No, they're not. They won't do it, and they can't legally do it now. It's an overthrow. That's a whole other sort of science fiction discussion, but it's not really going to happen. Again, the Army mission: defend U.S. territory and the occupied areas, overcome any aggression that impairs our nation's peace and security. Does that cover a lot of ground? Yeah, it does. It's a huge, huge mission. When this is sort of talked about, it's one of those things like, okay, who gets to define the aggressor? Who gets to define who imperils our peace and security? Who says that's being done?
Congress does.
Exactly right. The elected officials. Does the Army get to go say, okay, we're going to go and invade Mexico? No. Who does that? Who tells us what to do? The elected officials of the United States of America. The people elect the representatives who tell us, the military, what to do. And so when people have a tendency to kind of complain about what the military may or may not be doing, and they're not really being aware of why it's happening, they need to ask their elected officials. Nobody elected me. Nobody elected the colonel. The people who are elected, your representatives, that's the way that the people express their desire, and that's who sends us off to war. And so there's an old, recently last 10 years about Iraq and Afghanistan. It's more about, if you're going to complain about the war, but don't protest the warrior. Because he's going to where you told him to go. If that guy's in Afghanistan or that gal's in Iraq, it's because the elected people, the representatives of the nation, told them to go there. So understand that these people are doing what they've been told to do in a very difficult environment. Some aircraft up here. Actually, what have we got here?
C-130.
C-130. Oh, good, all Air Force cadets ought to know that. What's this? Apache. And this is?
Tank.
That tank. Anybody know what it is?
A personnel mover.
Bradley.
It's a personal carrier. It's called. It's a M2 Bradley. It's a mini tank. It basically has a 25 caliber Bushmaster gun. It has on the side here. These are tow missiles. This box swings up and you fire wire guided missiles. It's a tank killer in some ways. Really, it fights other armored personnel carriers. And inside, in a very cramped little area, it's supposed to be 8 infantry soldiers like myself who ride to battle. And these were designed to fight off the Soviets. They had a very large mechanized force. And in the Army, in the infantry, we have various kinds of infantry. And the guys who ride in these things are called mechanized infantry. Guys like me who walk around on our feet all day long carrying a huge rucksack, we're called light infantry, which I always found very hilarious because when I got 80 pounds on my back, I didn't feel very light at all. But the bottom line is this is just an example of what we call the combined arms force. The C-130, I am very familiar with C-130s. I spent almost 3/4 of my career in airborne units. These are my master parachutist wings. And I spent a lot of time jumping out of C-130s. Love the airplane. It's great, but it's a terrible jump. It's a terrible jump. Get knocked out, spun around, and flipped over in your head. But anyways, the bottom line is this is the Army's mission. One of the things that the Army is, and I want to make this up front, is we are the last resource and the last element of the United States military. We hold the line. When the United States Army is committed, the United States of America is committed to any course of action. If the Air Force flies over something or the Navy steams around the edges of a country, is the U.S. necessarily committed? Not really. But when you put boots on the ground, that's a term you'll always hear. When there are boots on the ground, is the United States Army and the United States of America committed to that action? Yes. And that's why it's very tricky. We'll be happy to fly drones overhead, or F-15s, or do reconnaissance, or we'll steam the Navy in circles around your coastline. But we won't necessarily put anybody on the ground, because when you do that, you're committed. And when American bodies start coming back in body bags on C-130s or C-17s, you're committed. And so the United States Army is often complained, some people complain that we're too big, and we're too heavy, and we're too ponderous. And that's not necessarily untrue. We are. But we need to be that way because if it's like, you know, when you're in a gunfight, you can shoot from a distance. But as someone once said, if you're in a knife fight, you are definitely involved. You know, you are face to face and poking each other and bleeding all over the place. You are committed to that fight. And that's what the Army does. We are the last line, the true deployment, the last measure of American involvement. All right, get on. Back. Okay, the structure of the United States Army. It was just part of it starts with the Secretary of Defense and the overall DOD, Department of Defense. If any of you are going to the military, you will belong to DOD. It's the broad category. I've got another class, and we'll talk more about Department of Defense in a broader category. But it then comes down to the Department of the Army. Is this a civilian or is this an officer? Secretary of the Army is what? A civilian or an officer? Civilian. Civilian. Is the Undersecretary of the Army a civilian or an officer? Civilian. Right. Chief of Staff of the Army is what? Officer. And then it works the way down. There's an old saying in the Pentagon, which fortunately I was never stationed at. What outranks a 4-star general? What outranks a 4-star general? A 3-piece suit. Exactly right. That's the old joke. There is a very specific tradition, and it's unique, at least it was initially, to the United States of America, is that the military was completely subservient to civilian authority. We take our orders from the President, from the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense. These are all civilians, and they run the Department of Defense. And again, like I said, when we send people off to war, it's civilians representing the people of this country that do that. And they need to be aware of what they're asking the military to do. So we have sort of the Chief of Staff of the Army, and he's called the Chief of Staff of the Army. Is he called the Commander of the Army? Who's the Commander of the Army? President. The President, the Commander-in-Chief of all services. Does not command anybody in wartime. He provides forces. And you go over here, Forces Command. These are where primarily all the combat forces operate. Training and Doctrine Command, where all the schools are. If you're going to go in the Army and become an Apache pilot, this is where you would go to Training and Doctrine Command, called TRADOC, and they would send you off to Fort Rucker, Alabama for a year of learning how to fly Apaches. And then there's Army Materiel Command. What's that about? Logistics. As Rommel once said, the great German commander, and it's a very great quote on his part, "My personnel officer tells me who I have. My intelligence officer tells me where I should fight. My operations officer tells me who I should fight. But my logistics officer tells me if I can fight." Without logistics, without fuel, without ammunition, without food, without medicine, without all that long list of things that we need to do logistics, you're not going anywhere. You're going to sit there in a real pretty aircraft and not fly very far.
Col Hink, we have a lot of kids here who are very interested in the Army. I know applying to West Point and different things. Raise your hand if you other guys are interested in the Army. Okay, look on this map. You're going to be on one of those spots.
Yep.
It's just a fact.
You will fall into one of these categories. And you also, the other part about the military, it's very important to understand, we don't all stay in the same place. If you're in some place in the military for more than 3 years, that's a long time. Most of us, our careers have spanned all over the world. Many jobs here, many jobs, goes back and forth. There's a lot of involvement in those sorts of things. And then there's this is called CONUS, or Continental United States. This is where all this stuff is. And then you've got OCONUS, so where would that be? Overseas, OCONUS. You've got U.S. Army Europe, you've got U.S. Army Pacific, you've got 8th Army in Korea, as part of U.S. Army South is Central and South America in Panama. Well, they used to be in Panama, and they're actually now in Florida. They've been moved up. And then these other parts, military medical, Corps of Engineers. Corps of Engineers, you might hear about Corps of Engineers all the time. It's a very largely civilian force, but it is run by the Army as the Corps of Engineers. CID, this is the Army's FBI. If you want to be a police officer or to become an investigator, the CID does all that. Who's seen NCIS on TV? Okay, this is the Army's NCIS, Criminal Investigation, the CID. In Army Intelligence and Security Command, it's changed over the years. This is a relatively old slide, but this is the guys and gals who are our spies, who do our intelligence gathering, who do all kinds of intelligence gathering. One of the least understood things in the world, I think, but one of the neatest ones. We all love James Bond. We all love spies. We all, ooh, that's cool. This is probably one of the hardest working and most unheralded group of people you ever saw in your life. They go in deep, dark buildings with no windows behind 5 doors, and they look at secret stuff, and they try to figure out what it means. If you want to be a spy, you're not going to be James Bond driving around on Aston Martins. I'm afraid you're going to be in a building looking at thousands and thousands of pages of documents. And that was never one I think I wanted to do. Okay, what is the purpose of a peacetime army? Anybody know? Come on, these are your questions now. What is the purpose of a peacetime army?
Well, it doesn't. You're not going to be in peacetime forever, so you're going to need an army to fight.
Right. So we're getting ready for the next war, right? But what happens if you don't have a peacetime army? Would you have a war?
Somebody would want it.
Well, see, there's an argument, and another one of the set of slides talks about this. The framers of the Constitution never intended to us to have what's called a standing army, which means it's there, available, and always things. They thought we'd have a militia. You've all heard that term, right? We would have National Guard or some form of militia, and then we would constitute an army to defend ourselves. Well, and this was really the mentality really before World War I and World War II in some cases, was these aren't our problems. Europe is not our problem. Asia is not our problem. Why are they not our problems? What is the United States blessed with on our east and west coast? Oceans. 2 big honking oceans. And has anybody ever bothered us? Well, the Canadians send cold weather down and it comes up from the south. But no, we are an eminently, wonderfully defensive position because of our ability to have these huge oceans. We really need a decent navy, but do we really need a big army? No. And that argument goes on today. A peacetime army is one of those things that people say the framers of the Constitution never intended us to have. Because if you have one, what do you usually do with it?
Use it.
You use it. Oh, let's go over here. Let's go over there. Well, we got these guys sitting around. They can go do something. Let's go into Mali in Africa or down south. Or let's go over to the Philippines and fight the Moros. It's called adventurism. Have you ever heard that term? We get a little bit adventurous. Let's just send a few guys over there. Let's go. Hey, there's just a couple hundred guys to Vietnam. That won't cause any problems, will it? Yeah, I don't know. 3 million people later, it caused some problems. When you talk about the Army, and this is, again, it's a high school class for JROTC, we're always kind of interested in what it is that the cadets and the students feel about the Army and understand it. When you guys are Air Force, I'm sure they ask you about your fellow cadets or fellow students, ask you about the Air Force. Is there much discussion, those of you that are interested in the military and in the Army, is there discussions or talks about that in other classes? Do you have anybody that has a dislike of the military, any of your teachers? We run into that all the time. But is there someone that talks about the Army that's like, well, it's all about Rambo. You watch Rambo movies, and that's exactly how the Army is. Do you ever get into one of those? It's a real issue. One of the problems is, and it's another slide down the road, but the percent of people in this country who have served in the military is about what?
10%? 1%?
About 3. About 3%. So the millions of people in this country, there are very few people relative to our population that they've ever served in the military. So where do they get their perceptions of the military from? TV, movies, war stories from the guy down the street who was he shoveled out latrines in Korea, but he was actually Rambo in his own mind, And we get a lot of that. People have a very misconception. I mean, in the Air Force, everybody's a fighter pilot, right? Sure they are. Yep. No, I mean, in the Air Force, what percent of people actually fly?
2%. I think it's about 2 or 3% fly.
Yeah, they actually fly. The rest of them do what? Logistics. That's right. They make those airplanes fly so they don't fall out of the sky. As somebody riding in one, that's very important to me. I want to make sure they work. In the Army, how many people actually fight in combat? What percent of that would you think? 5 to 10. Yeah, it depends on your definition. But really, it's called the tip of the spear. You've got this little tiny spear here of what the Army fights with. And you got this part. And this part is about 5%, more or less. And you got some combat support, then you got all the rest of it down here. And this is all, 80% of what really, as this group kind of fluctuates in here, we're not really sure what, because they go back and forth between fighting and supporting. Some of the signal guys they don't really intend to fight, but if someone shoots at them, they're going to shoot back. If there's somebody out there trying to do something, intelligence guys trying to collect intelligence, and they're getting shot at, well, they're going to shoot back, but that's not their job. If they're out there shooting at somebody, they're not doing their job, they're doing somebody else's job. They're doing my job. So we want to make sure that they're involved in doing their job. But it's a very small point. We call that the tip of the spear. Same in the Air Force. The guys who fly combat aircraft, and I won't beat up on the colonel too much, but there's always this kind of mentality about fighter jocks and lifters and helicopter pilots. And
I tell my students that the Army has more aircraft than any other armed force.
Right.
My brother was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. I was drilled by that my whole life. So you have a lot more aircraft than any other armed forces.
Yeah, we have thousands of helicopters, but they also have the same mentality. An Apache pilot, how does he look at a Black Hawk pilot? He's just a lifter. He just carries stuff around. And a Chinook pilot, that's a flying school bus. And the low, and then the Air Force, you've got the fast and high, and you got the low and slow. And
the fast and high and the targets.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Well, I was getting ready to say, when you show the picture of the tank and they go, what is it? I'm surprised somebody didn't say a target.
Yeah. It is. That's why it's really heavy. It has a lot of armor on it. Although I won't start with a lot of war stories, but a lot of times in Germany, we'd call them the F-16s, and they fly real fast and real high, and they burn fuel like crazy. And so by the time you get them into the target area, they got to go home. You get this term, maybe get one pass over the target. Oh, we didn't see it. We're bingo. What does bingo mean? Out of gas. Well, that was helpful. Thanks a lot, guys. They're gone for and then they're not back for 24 hours because they got to go to the club and drink beer.
You got golf.
Yeah, I know. Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm down there rolling around the mud going, that was really useful. But every service has its own peculiarities. The Navy is by far the worst. Why is the Navy the worst?
Okay, well, hold it. How many people here want to be in the Navy?
Who's the Navy guys? Any Navy folks?
We have 3 applied naval.
Oh, okay. And the Navy's great, but why does the Navy doesn't need the Air Force or the Army? Why?
They're all there.
Well, they've got their own Air Force, and they've got their own Army, which is the Marine Corps. So what do they need us for? You get a Navy guy a little bit tipsy, and he'll be happy to tell you about that for hours. So how the Army's irrelevant, the Air Force is irrelevant, we're the ones. Okay. So you go,
It's called morale.
Yes.
It's called morale.
You don't want to get into a bar fight over stuff like that. That's not worth doing. But every so often you'll get that story. And I have my own stories about that. But anyways, and then, how does the Army contribute to the nation in peacetime? Well, we talked about it, but like Katrina. They can be federalized areas. We can move in, and if there's huge crises, we do support the civilian population, the civilian supports in other areas that are useful to them. The primary reason is that we have to be very careful. A governor or a local National Guard commander may not want a federalized force coming into his area. I can guarantee you that Major General Salazar, who's the commander of the National Guard here in Arizona, he's not keen on seeing that 2-star general walk out the gates of Fort Huachuca and tell him what to do. There's a certain amount of pride and a certain amount of proprietary desire in those sorts of things. All the services have them, and it's a very tricky issue. It's a very legal issue. And it really involves the way the Constitution was created and the way the federal government and the state governments see themselves. You don't all get that a lot at this level, but as you move up and as you become part of the military, or you just operate in the civilian world as an adult, you will see that these legal balances are very tricky, and they're very important. And so, it's just legal stuff. Well, it's not legal. It's how we function, how the Constitution is framed, and how we've managed to interpret it. Finally, is there any other questions that anyone has about the active duty Army that I can answer right now? Anything about how it operates, what you do if you're intending to go in the military? What was the ones that were interested in going into the Army? What branch are you interested in?
Aviation.
Aviation, so you want to fly. Have you been physically tested for that yet?
No.
Okay. One of them, and I'm sure
He's a junior. These are some of these
Okay.
are junior. Well, actually, Jared's a senior. He's going to go into ROTC.
where are you going?
Embry-Riddle.
Embry-Riddle. You going to fly? Interested in doing that? Or?
No.
Okay. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the only reason I ask is, and I'm sure the Colonel mentioned this, aviators are by far the most susceptible to physical activities. Air, you got to be able to see, hear.
I thought you said ego.
No, that too. But that's like, don't get me started. Again, years and years in the infantry, which we are the primary applicant of aviation, lift aviation, or attack aviation, and I spent many, many years in the Army. In airborne, you get just jumping out of airplanes. And so, obviously, the airplanes we jump out of 90% of the time are Air Force airplanes, although we do jump out of helicopters. That happened. You saw a little picture that was going like a guy jumping out of the back of a Chinook. So you get to know aircraft pretty well, and you get to know pilots, you get to know all the rules and limitations of aviation. What is one of the greatest limitations of aviation? Anybody know? We're suffering it right now. Weather. Weather there's nothing quite like having planned out an air mission for the last 2 months, and you get this call, nope, sorry, it's clouded in. No, can't make it. The wind's too high. It's just a function. I mean, the Air Force they are the weather people of the military. The Army doesn't even have weather people anymore. If we want to get weather, we go to the Air Force to get it, because they're very good. And that's a whole specialty within the Air Force are weather folks.
And actually, there's a low band. If you want to be a weatherman, you can get scholarships to Embry-Riddle and stuff
Right.
like that
Yeah.
too.
No, meteorology is a key thing. It affects far more than most people appreciate. Aviation, it affects gunnery. If you're going to shoot artillery or other things, the air and how it flows, wind, density, barometric pressure, all those things affect gunnery targets and all kinds, down to millimeters. So it's really, weather's a very big deal. But the final thing about the active Army is it is a federal force. It is designed to be deployed overseas, and on very rare occasions when it's really critical, it is very difficult to go inside the United States. We do that, but only when we're asked to or when the President of the United States deems it's necessary. And that is in the coordination with the state forces. The biggest part about it is simply that the Constitution shows that the federal forces are supposed to be subservient to the states, and the states are not supposed to have federal forces imposed on them. Again, the term posse comitatus simply means that the federal forces cannot be involved in a state area without sufficient discussion, involvement, and really agreement on the part of the state organizations. So it's one of those things that we are very careful about. People talk about all the black helicopters coming in and the secret people moving around. Now, they don't exist. I hate to say it. A lot of people love that conspiracy stuff, but they don't exist. And if they do, they're not very good at what they are because we don't ever see them. The only other question, let me see, I think that moves on to the last one. Oh, here we go, the branches real quick. Okay. The Army branches, combat arms I talked about, combat support, that's those guys in the middle, and combat service support. The branches have a lot to do with what kind of involvement you are. Here are the combat arms. These are what essentially we fight with. We fight with the infantry, my branch, ground pounders, guys on the ground carrying a rifle, walking through the woods, the dirt of the mountains. Armor, what's armor? Tanks, heavy tanks, heavy armored vehicles, a lot of maintenance, high speed, the M1 tanks, the Bradley you just saw, those are all infantry. Those are all armored tanks or field armor. Field artillery, what's that? Big guns, the artillery. High angle fire, 105 howitzers, 175 howitzers, missile artillery. You all seen the MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems? It's kind of thing wheels around and shoots out about 12 missiles real fast. That's MLRS. Air defense artillery, a favorite of the Air Force. What is that?
Don't shoot me down.
Yeah, shoot down airplanes. What is the Patriot missile? Have you all seen that or heard about that? That falls under air defense. More and more now, because of the success of the U.S. Air Force, is there really anybody in the world that challenges us in the air? No, really. The Air Force not only can have air superiority, they can establish what's called air supremacy. There's really nobody in the world that can challenge our Air Force. It's the best in the world, bar none. Don't mind saying it. So what is our threat from the air now?
Missiles.
Exactly, missiles. So air defense has turned into more about a missile defense, which is very tricky. When you try and shoot down missiles with missiles, as someone once described, it's like trying to hit a bullet with another bullet. Very hard to do. We're not really good at it yet. We're working on it. There's been a few that have been successful, but the Army has really sort of shifted from air defense to missile defense. Matter of fact, in most wartime, in Iraq and Afghanistan, air defense artillery works for who? Anybody know? You're wearing the uniform. They work for the Air Force. Normally, and it makes the Air Force much happier, if you've got a bunch of Patriot missiles that can shoot down in the airplane we've got, they go in there what they're called OPCON, or operationally commanded by the Air Force. And the Air Force tells the air defenders what to do. Okay. Aviation, about helicopters, engineers, special forces. I'm not going to be big about that. When I say non-accession, it means you can't sign up special forces. You must enlist for another branch and then move over to Green Berets or those sorts of things.
You want to stop it right now here because we're coming up to...
Yeah, let's stop it right now.
All right. Okay, South Flight. Attend. Hut! Dismissed.
Go do great things.
Good job, folks.
I think that's the first time.
That's fine, that's fine.
Yeah, it is.
Woo!